Hello everybody, I'm Connor, and welcome back to my weekly movie reviews. It's the last week of January, and with it came one movie, Maze Runner: The Death Cure. Well, that's not entirely true. Hostiles, the latest from Scott Cooper starring Christian Bale, also got a wide release, but it's also the last of the limited release December 2017 movies, which are now getting a wide release for awards consideration. Because I want to start this year out on a clean slate and am reviewing 2018 movies only, I will not be reviewing Hostiles. Unlike I, Tonya, Phantom Thread, The Post, and others, I didn't get around to seeing Hostiles since I work full-time, go to school full-time, am already running a little late on this video, and it also didn't get any awards attention, so I may end up watching it, but I'm not in any hurry. So the only movie you can expect from me this week is the dystopian YA sci-fi action-adventure threequel, Maze Runner: The Death Cure, and I will also be covering this weekend's box office afterwards. Timestamps, as always, can be found in the description, and fair warning, spoilers for everything moving forward. Everything changed in March of 2012 for the PG-13 young adult fantasy subgenre. What had been dominated by Harry Potter and, more recently at that point, the Twilight Saga for about a decade was now shifting away from high fantasy to a more gritty and violent, although still PG-13 friendly, sci-fi dystopian future action place with the arrival of The Hunger Games. The Hunger Games brought with it a more broad scope and was more sprawling with a strong element of political satire. This is important information to lay out because in the wake of the Hunger Games' unprecedented success, several film series were immediately put into production based on young adult sci-fi dystopian future book series that centered around teenagers fighting against the militant, fascistic regime of evil grown-ups. Among these series put into production were The Mortal Instruments, which only got one film in before scrapping its plans, called City of Bones in 2013, Divergent in 2014, and The Maze Runner, also in 2014. For a few years there, this was a bankable model of adapting a 3 or 4 book series and splitting that final book into 2 movies to increase the return. However, late 2015, early 2016 proved to be the ending of that fad, as The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2, the last in its series, finished well behind all of its predecessors. The Divergent series risked splitting its final book in 2, but folded after the first half of Allegiant disappointed significantly, and Lionsgate opted to change their plans with the final half, under the title Ascendant, to be a TV movie to later kick off a television spin-off series, none of which has actually happened yet, almost 2 years after that announcement. Which brings us to The Maze Runner, which opened in later 2014, impressively making over $100 million domestically on a $34 million production budget. Naturally, a sequel, Maze Runner: The Scorch Trials, was released the following year when most audiences' appetite for this sort of thing were getting stale and a lot of people were getting their anti-grown-up YA dystopian future sci-fi franchises not called The Hunger Games confused. The sequel disappointed, making only just over $80 million domestically on an increased $61 million production budget. Worldwide, however, both Maze Runner films did similarly, making $348 million and $312 million respectively, so a third was on the way. Today's subject for review, Maze Runner: The Death Cure. Truth be told, I've never been too hot on this whole scene. I was pretty relieved when these sort of movies started disappointing financially, and as a result, The Death Cure feels like a relic from the cinematic landscape of 3 years ago. Not that that's by design. These YA sci-fi dystopian movie series all had an annual release schedule, and production halted on this movie for a while after series star Dylan O'Brien sustained an injury. I think this movie was initially supposed to be released in late 2016. I liked the second Hunger Games movie and found the first Divergent to be something of a guilty pleasure way back when I first saw it, but everything else I found to be mediocre at best and unendingly lame at worst, with not much in between. The first Maze Runner was meh, and I cannot for the life of me remember The Scorch Trials, but like most people, I got it confused with the desert terrain sameness of the Divergent movies. I know Aidan Gillen is in these movies, as I distinctly remember him yelling, "Welcome to the Scorch" last movie. But was this the series with Barry Pepper, or is this the one with Jeff Daniels? Was Giancarlo Esposito a Maze Runner guy? Well, no. I think I remember a scene where Theo James and he had a conversation, except, wait, I just saw the movie, and Giancarlo Esposito was in it, so I guess he was in the last. I know the core young adult cast of these franchises, but it's the adult cast in the world that I get mixed up in my mind, and then I forget what happens in these movies as a result, which I had entirely forgotten about. Anyways, the premise this time around is that in the future, the deadly flare virus has taken out a large portion of the world population, and Dylan O'Brien's Thomas, our blank leading man, leader of a young, diverse group of kids on the run from the sinister company led by grown-ups called Wicked, is trying desperately to rescue a friend who was kidnapped by Wicked last movie before he can get on a boat with other kids, and Barry Pepper, to go to a promised land far away from Wicked's clutches. In case you forgot, which I had, Wicked has been trying to find a cure for the flare virus and looking into the genome of the immune to find answers. Mino, the kid who Thomas and company are trying to rescue from Wicked, is being tested on by, among others, Teresa, an ally from the first movie who revealed herself as a double agent last movie, which I had entirely forgotten about. Right out of the gate, I should say that I don't think The Death Cure is a bad movie, and if you like the other Maze Runner movies, then you'll probably like this one, with its many well-directed action scenes and genuinely great stunt work. I don't think it's as good as the first, but I think it's better than what I can remember feeling about the Scorch Trials. I don't, however, think The Death Cure is a good movie either, and find it far too long at 2.5 hours, with structure being its biggest problem. Putting positives first, I think there are a handful of good performances here. I only know Dylan O'Brien from these movies and last year's American Assassin. He was apparently also in Deepwater Horizon, but I don't remember him in that movie. And while I have yet to be impressed with him, I do think there's a great actor in him somewhere. He's clearly a committed actor. He nearly died making this movie because he did his own stunts after all. And I'm just waiting for him to land a role in a Richard Linklater movie or something. That same intensity and commitment can be seen here too, even though I think he's straddled with a weak character. The clear surprise for me was Thomas Brodie-Sangster, who is given the most difficult material here and rises to the occasion with a heart and sincerity I was surprised by. His character, Newt, has caught the flare virus between movies and is understandably desperate and scared, but he always tries to carry a cool head and remain calm. Obviously, there will be obligatory moments of losing his cool, but those moments were sold in a manner I was impressed with and thought felt human and real in the world they had created. His best moments come when he fully becomes a flare zombie, or whatever one-word noun they call those things, and he has to fight the inevitable transformation. This could have been ridiculous and embarrassing like Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in last year's The Mummy, but young Mr. Brodie-Sangster made it work. He also has a post-mortem letter that serves as the film's ending monologue, and it's well delivered and maybe the best part of the movie. Most of the other performances are pedestrian and serviceable, but Aidan Gillen is wonderfully hammy, although I have no idea what that accent is, and it's always nice to see the reliable Barry Pepper and Giancarlo Esposito no matter what they're in. The biggest compliment I can give this movie, though, was the production. The opening action sequence, in the tradition of Toy Story 3, Fast 5, and Skyfall, begins with a chase sequence involving a train, and it's quite good. My brother described the scene after we left the theater as a sort of Christopher Nolan take on Mad Max, and I couldn't put it better. The staging and blocking of the action, the way it's shot with long takes that zip around, the solid editing that lets the action breathe and speak for itself, this was just a wonderful way to start the movie. For that matter, there's another action scene not much longer after this opening, which takes place in a tunnel that, while a little on the excessive side of things, had a flare zombie jump on the hood of a moving vehicle, and we cut to a wide shot that clearly featured a real person doing the stunt of being on the hood of a moving vehicle. To that point, I do think the action becomes tiring and exhausting, but it's captured in a consistently energetic and competent way. I'm anticipating what director Wes Ball does next, since he does have a talent that I want to see develop. Right now, the influence of J.J. Abrams is extremely noticeable, but discount J.J. Abrams is much more inspired than anything something like Divergent had to offer. The special effects utilize good old practical effects when at all possible, since this 2.5 hour long sci-fi action movie has a budget of only $62 million. And the computer effects and green screen integration are rather decent, if a little noticeable. This movie, for its length and subject matter, never looks like it cost the relatively small price of $62 million. Unfortunately, the aspect of Ball's direction I wish were stronger is tone. This material is, honestly real nutty, and the whole movie is played way too straight. I can't help but feel like this exact same script could be made into another movie, but be a satire that knows how goofy it is and that most audiences don't care about this subgenre anymore. That's not entirely this movie's fault, as its production was delayed indefinitely, but that doesn't change that this movie's coming out when it's coming out, and what's in the movie. Will Poulter's character from the first movie comes back with virtually no explanation as to how he's even alive, and is basically an entirely new character. And I can't tell if the movie's playing characters asking Will Poulter how he's even alive for comedy or not. So Thomas has a self-destructive savior complex and is revealed to be all but the chosen one with the perfect magical blood that Wicked has been looking for. There are about 5 or 6 last-minute saves when all seems lost, and almost as many instances of "I'm not leaving without you" or some variation thereof. There's a legion of exiles who rebel and revolt against Wicked in a revolution war scenario. Pretty much everything dramatic here has been seen consistently in popular media for the last 2 decades, be it The Matrix, the Star Wars prequels, Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, or any number of other fantasy franchises. Heck, Thomas has death cure blood, and the movie ends with him repeatedly punching somebody. That's basically Star Trek Into Darkness, right? Geez, J.J. Abrams' influence is really overt, isn't it? And that's on top of the constant running, hitting, shouting, sweeping cameras, and the Wicked medical facility that looks exactly like the Starship Enterprise. There were a lot of things here that I chuckled about under my breath out of the sheer goofiness of it all, and it's weird how straight it's all played considering. But there are some serious story, structure, and character problems with the Death Cure. Firstly, I think the story misses the core dilemma of its premise. So much of the runtime is dedicated to the rescue of Mino, who, for all intents and purposes, is just a MacGuffin. He's been a very small part of these movies, as well as having a tangential relationship to Thomas in comparison to the others, and the first hour and a half is dedicated to the status quo of his captivity. Thomas is revealed to have blood that is the cure-all for the flare virus, and his closest friend, Newt, has the flare virus. To me, the clear conflict at the core of this movie should have been Thomas learning about his super blood early, maybe rescue Mino 20 minutes in, and come to terms with whether or not he should turn himself in to become Wicked's guinea pig for the greater good, maybe surrender under the terms that Newt be cured, or make a stand against Wicked because he knows they're evil. How is the most important relationship in this movie, Thomas and Newt, put so far on the back burner? Secondly, the structure is all out of whack. 2.5 hours is way too long for this material anyway, but so much of it could have been cut and retooled. Mino's rescue takes far too long, over half the movie, and most of the stuff that happens along the way is rather superfluous. There's no reason for Will Poulter's character to be here. He could have been anybody, and he feels like an entirely new character regardless. He was a lot of people's favorite thing about that first movie, and his character exploded afterwards in The Revenant. And later Detroit, but that was probably after they filmed this movie. So it feels like he was shoehorned into this stew at the last minute because he's a fan favorite. Walton Goggins' revolution was going to happen anyway, so I don't understand why Thomas and crew couldn't just coordinate a way into Wicked City using the battle as a cover. All of the big story beats don't happen until the final 30 minutes or so when Walton Goggins and his army storm the city, and everything feels truncated as all get out. From what I hear, there's 5 books, and I don't know if they wanted to wrap this film series up as a trilogy, but having Newt die, Thomas confront evil business lady, get kidnapped by Aidan Gillen, have a fight scene with him after Teresa makes a cure, having that aircraft rescue with the death of Teresa, and a happily ever after epilogue all happen right at the end is so rushed. If they were just going to do this, then let that happen over the course of the last hour or so, not the last 30 minutes. Once Mino is rescued, he essentially leaves the story, so why waste so much time with a rescue mission that becomes pointless? Thirdly, I have to rag on the character stuff here, specifically Teresa, because she's not a character. She's kind of like Mac from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, with how she is constantly flip-flopping with her allegiances. The only reason Thomas is into her is because she looks like Kea Scodelario, which, makes sense, but it doesn't make sense in this movie. And I can never sympathize with her on a moral dilemma, because I don't know what that moral dilemma really is. She chooses Thomas in the end, but why? She's an enigma throughout the whole movie and not an interesting one, so her death makes absolutely no impact on me. Patricia Clarkson's mysterious evil business lady is too vague all the way to the end. She's just evil and calculated because that's her archetype. At least Aidan Gillen's crazy dude has the excuse of having the flare virus to increase his desperation. And honestly, there actually could have been a really neat dynamic between Newt being desperate, having the flare virus, and Aidan Gillen, but nothing really comes of that anyways. It's just a parallel that's kind of left on the floor. What was up with Walton Goggins' character? His big sacrifice was strange, and you'd think he'd coordinate a plan of attack with the people who are infiltrating the headquarters of his enemies. Will Poulter looks baffled by the attack. Lastly, I got to touch on the wooden performances. Many of the younger characters are just cameos in this one, and most of their line readings are as flat as Kansas. Rosa Salazar's potential love interest for Thomas doesn't have much to do outside of punch things when they need punching and pine after Thomas, and Miss Salazar doesn't seem to be able to make much more of this character than I would have. She comes across as rather wooden, and I'm really hoping for more from her when I see Alita battle Angel later this year. Basically, outside of all of those I mentioned earlier, are all flat. And that'll about do it for me on Maze Runner: The Death Cure, an impressively made feature with really impressive action sequences, and maybe too many, that features some fine performances among many other wooden performances that never quite takes hold of its best ideas and crumbles under its poorly structured story. I'm going to give Maze Runner: The Death Cure a 5 out of 10. You know what? No, that doesn't seem right. I'm going to give Maze Runner: The Death Cure a 4.5 out of 10. This week at the box office, Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle was dethroned after a 3-week streak at the top spot. Coming in at number 1 this week was Maze Runner: The Death Cure in its debut as it grossed $24.1 million. I can only imagine this must be a disappointment for 20th Century Fox, since the first 2 installments in this series opened to $32.5 million and $30.3 million respectively. The Death Cure had a budget of $62 million, which is $1 million more than its immediate predecessor, and this significantly downward box office trajectory ain't good. Luckily, this is looking like the final in the series, and it already has made over $100 million worldwide, so it may at least break even. Jumanji: Welcome to the Jungle dropped to second this week, making $16.1 million, which is an impressive 17.2% dip from last week, especially considering this is Jumanji's 6th week in theaters. So far, its domestic total is $337.8 million, and once again, its production budget was $90 million. Coming in third was Hostels with $10.1 million in its first week of wide release. I must say I'm surprised by this movie's turnout. Hostels received no awards nominations and features an impressive cast that people have proven to not show up for. Remember Christian Bale and Oscar Isaac were in that movie The Promise last year? And the marketing was rather on the limited side. Color me impressed. Guess I might have to see it now. Jumping up to 4th place from 5th place last week is The Greatest Showman, making $9.5 million, continuing to drop week to week with impressively small intervals. This time the drop-off was 10.3%. I've said it before and I'll say it again. That's some good word of mouth. 5th place was Steven Spielberg's The Post, making an additional $9.1 million, dropping only 22.3%. Wow, did this top 5 experience some small drop-offs all across the board. 6th place saw 12 Strong, dropping 45.1% from 2nd place last week with $8.68 million, although its theater count increased by 16. Like last week, Den of Thieves trailed closely behind 12 Strong with $8.63 million, dipping 43.2%. The Shape of Water jumped into the 8th spot after its staggering 13 Oscar nominations, with an increase in theater count by over 1,000. Guillermo del Toro's latest made $5.9 million, bringing its domestic total to $37.9 million. Dropping to 9th place and continuing to disappoint at the North American box office, much to my dismay, was the endlessly charming and wonderful Paddington 2. Don't really know what else to add that I haven't made clear in weeks past. Shame on you, America. It ultimately doesn't matter because it's made bank in Europe. And rounding out the top 10 was the Indian epic Padmavat, making $4.4 million. I haven't even heard of this movie, but it's showing at my local theater, so I might give it a shot. It beat out Star Wars: The Last Jedi, which has officially left the top 10 in its 7th week in theaters. Also worth noting is Forever My Girls dropped to 13th place after increasing its theater count by 310. Thank you everybody for checking out this week's movie reviews. January 2018 is over and in the books, and I must say it was surprisingly tame. I wouldn't say we got any good movies, but we got mostly mediocre movies with a couple bad ones, and one really bad one, but there were no terrible, awful 2 out of 10s or 1 out of 10s, no Resident Evil The Final Chapter or Black Hats, and most of the movies I saw actually looked like movies I would see in a theater any other time of the year. Forever My Girl and Insidious The Last Key certainly looked lower budget, but not cheap, and the only one I can think of that did look cheap was Proud Mary, and even that had spurts that looked normally cinematic. Although, I do have to say 2016 had a pretty good January too. Sure, we got the abominable 50 Shades of Black, but we also got an okay above average movie in The Finest Hours, and an actually good movie in Kung Fu Panda 3. Back then I took that as a sign of good faith that 2016 would be a great year for film, and then it turned into what the 2016 film year turned out to be, which was not good. A couple observations about this January. There were no token piece of trash animated movies. This is usually a staple of Januaries. Norm of the North, The Nut Job, Strange Magic, etc. Neither were there any lame comedies, which also are usually hallmarks of January, like Ride Along, The Wedding Ringer, Ride Along 2, the aforementioned 50 Shades of Black, etc. This year's January mostly saw action movies, and not the lower caliber, how is this not straight to Blu-ray fare I'm used to getting this time of year. Good job, I guess, January, but now you got me cautious about what's coming next this year. Next week, the first week of February, we're only getting one wide-release film, the Helen Mirren-led horror movie Winchester. In years past, the first week of February has produced some highly enjoyable movies, but it's also usually a weekend that sees the release of 3 movies. Anyway, we'll see next week, and until then, I'll see you at the movies.